Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Britt's return to Port Charles was not marked by a tearful reunion, a joyful embrace, or even a whisper of warning. It was a storm. A silent, unpredictable, and consuming storm that descended over the city like a shadow refusing to lift. The last anyone had seen or heard of her, she had been presumed dead, lost somewhere along the Mediterranean coast under mysterious circumstances that only deepened with time. Her body was never recovered, her name slowly faded from headlines, and Port Charles, though scarred by her memory, began to heal in her absence. But now, her sudden reappearance shattered that fragile healing. She was alive, but not as she had been. Britt Westbourne had returned, but it was as if she had brought something else back with her, something invisible, something dark. The timing of her return was no coincidence. Britt's re-emergence paralleled a series of deeply disturbing occurrences at a remote and luxurious retreat known as Five Poppies, a place that had, until now, been whispered about in elite circles for its medical innovation and high-level discretion. But beneath the spa's golden surface, a rot was festering. Whispers of unethical experiments, of clandestine surveillance, and of patients who entered but were never truly allowed to leave had begun to spread. Britt's connection to the retreat was undeniable, but when people reached out to her, the woman they once knew was no longer present. She evaded every attempt at contact, avoided familiar places, and shunned the people who once formed the core of her heart. Most unsettling of all were the patterns of her behavior, the nightly injections, the cryptic phone calls, the distant gaze that betrayed a mind ensnared in something far beyond her control. To most, she appeared functional. She walked, talked, and even smiled, at times. But to those who knew her best, like Jason and Liesel, something was off. Jason had seen people manipulated before. He had lived through mind control, drug addiction, and the twisted creations of criminal masterminds. But this was different. This wasn't just coercion. This was possession. Britt was acting as though she were operating under invisible strings. She was a puppet, but who was holding the crossbar? Liesel spiraled into guilt, her every thought consumed by the years she had spent entangled with Caesar Faison, the brilliant, deranged villain who had fathered Britt and left a legacy soaked in trauma and manipulation. Liesel had once given everything for him, blind to his horrors, until she saw the cost, her daughter's soul. She thought he was gone, destroyed, never to return. But Jason suspected otherwise. And when he received a shaky, terrified voicemail from Britt, filled with static, conflicting statements, and a chilling sense of urgency, he knew the truth lay within the walls of Five Poppies. Jason infiltrated the facility under cover of night, using old WSB contacts and brute determination to bypass the layers of security. Beneath the luxury facade, he descended into a basement, no, a bunker. There, in the cold sterile glow of LED lights and concrete walls, he discovered the heart of the nightmare. Files upon files labeled with the cryptic acronym CF protocol. Computers mapping neural activity. Monitors tracking behavioral patterns. Video loops of Britt sleeping, eating, walking, injecting herself. And then a screen flickered to life, playing a voice. That voice. A voice that once haunted Jason through decades of war, gravelly, deliberate, terrifyingly calm. It was Caesar Faison. The impossible had become reality. Faison had survived. He had staged his death once more, disappearing beneath the radar of law enforcement and intelligence networks, only to re-emerge in the shadows, more dangerous than ever. No longer a fugitive racing against time, he had become a puppet master building an empire out of silence and surveillance. Britt wasn't just his daughter, she was the prototype. Her DNA, inherited condition, and unique psychological profile made her the perfect subject. Using a new form of synthetic neural mapping and biochemical dependency, Faison had tethered her consciousness to his control system. Each injection was not just a sedative, it was a leash. Every move she made was pre-programmed, every emotion flattened by chemical precision. She existed, but only in the margins of her former self. Jason returned to Port Charles with the data and confronted Liesel. She broke. The weight of her own sins crashed down on her like a tidal wave, tearing her breath away. The man she had once loved, defended, even protected, had crossed a final, unforgivable line. He had reduced their daughter to a lab rat in his quest for transcendence. Liesel, shaken but fierce, vowed to undo what he had done, to save Britt or die trying. Together with Jason, they returned to 5 Poppies, not as seekers of truth, but as warriors of vengeance. They planted explosives at the heart of the control center, disabling the security grid and beginning their descent into the most secure sectors of the facility. Britt was found in a containment chamber, her body shivering, her skin pale and bruised, her eyes vacant. The machinery that monitored her beeped rhythmically, as if her body were nothing more than a data stream. Jason broke open the glass. Liesel ran to her side. Britt didn't speak. She barely blinked. Her hand still clutched a syringe. The horror of what had been done to her was written into her silence. Then came the final twist of the knife. As they prepared to extract Britt and leave, a hidden projector in the corner of the chamber flared to life, casting a ghostly blue image onto the far wall. Faison's face emerged once more, smiling with the wicked calm of a man who had calculated every contingency. He spoke with chilling finality, "You can burn this place. But my work, my legacy, lives in her." The video ended, and the chamber erupted in flame as Jason activated the charges and carried Britt out into the night. Now back in Port Charles, Britt remains under tight observation. Her body detoxifies slowly. Her mind is not yet her own. The Faison protocol runs deeper than Jason or Liesel had feared. Even unconscious, Britt occasionally mutters strings of numbers, foreign words, or references to places no one recognizes. Liesel works around the clock, determined to reverse the damage, to restore Britt's agency. But the deeper she delves, the more she realizes, Faison's reach extended far beyond one woman. The data extracted from the facility suggests there were others. Other subjects. Other daughters. Perhaps not by blood, but by design. Jason remains vigilant, a silent sentinel outside Britt's door. He knows better than anyone that with Faison, death is never final. His body may lie in ash, but his ideas, his experiments, his malevolent intelligence, they endure. Somewhere, another terminal waits for activation. Another soul waits to be hijacked. Another nightmare waits to awaken. And Port Charles, blissfully unaware of the war being waged in its shadows, sleeps on. But Jason does not sleep. Because he knows the storm Britt brought back isn't over. It's just begun. Even with the control center at 5 Poppies reduced to ashes, the war was far from over. In fact, the destruction marked only the beginning of something far more insidious and complex. The core of the system may have been shattered, but its reach extended beyond steel and servers, into minds, bloodlines, and entire generations. The most harrowing truth Jason uncovered wasn't just that Britt had been manipulated, it was that she had been one of many. The databases stored within the facility hinted at a sprawling network of experiments spanning continents and years, with subjects listed only by numbers, genetic tags, or cryptic codenames. Some of the profiles mirrored Britt's genome too closely for comfort. Variants. Iterations. Clones. Jason couldn't be sure, but the implications were clear. Faison's reach had gone far beyond his daughter. And so, the questions multiplied. If Caesar Faison had managed to resurrect himself from the dead, or worse, to upload his consciousness or imprint his personality into a digital construct, who had enabled it? Someone, somewhere, had financed the technology, hidden the facilities, silenced the witnesses. Figures like Professor Hank Dalton and Jen Sidwell, who once seemed like peripheral threats, now loomed larger. Were they architects in their own right, or merely Faison's puppets, tasked with spreading his ideology through scientific camouflage? The The more Jason and Liesel dug into the remnants of the destroyed system, the more disturbing the picture became. There were emails between Sidwell and unnamed recipients signed only with an archaic symbol, one linked to an old DVX splinter faction long believed dormant. These weren't rogue scientists operating in secret. This was a new order. The supposed miracle drug, initially developed under the guise of curing Huntington's disease, was never truly intended for healing. What Liesel discovered in her relentless analysis of the vials Britt had brought back proved far more chilling. The chemical compound was layered with nanoagents programmed to interface with synaptic pathways. At first glance, it replicated the function of neuroprotective agents that halted the progression of degenerative illnesses. But buried within the structure was a timed response code. A sequence that, when activated by specific frequencies or electromagnetic pulses, overrode natural neural activity. In essence, it allowed the subject to be remotely reprogrammed. To the outside world, it looked like salvation. But to those trapped within its grip, it was a prison. A beautifully marketed, pharmaceutically engineered prison. And Britt had been one of the first. She had not volunteered. Her abduction had been orchestrated under the pretense of a medical retreat. 5 Poppies had promised advanced trials for rare diseases. She had boarded a plane seeking hope and woken up in a lab as a prototype. Now, though physically free, her mind remained in fragments. Her memory, once sharp, defiant, sardonic, was a shifting sea of flashes and voids. Sometimes she would smile faintly at the sound of Jason's voice, only for the smile to vanish the next second as she recoiled from a memory that didn't feel like hers. Every morning, Jason read to her. Not from books, but from life, hers and his. He recounted the nights they danced at the nurses' ball, the surgeries she had performed with cutting precision, the coffee breaks they shared during the chaos at GH. He reminded her of who she was, over and over, day after day, hoping that his words would reawaken something real inside her. Some days, he'd catch her mouthing his name. On rare occasions, she whispered apologies, as if blaming herself for something only her subconscious remembered. Jason never blamed her. He blamed Faison, and the machine of cruelty that man had built. Liesel, too, never left Britt's side. Her transformation was radical, no longer the scheming, defensive woman known for questionable loyalties. She had become a mother again in the most elemental sense. She lived in her lab, running simulations, injecting mice with altered versions of the compound, dissecting tissue, mapping neural pathways, and hunting for anything that could reverse the imprinting process. She barely ate. She slept in a cot in the hospital's diagnostic wing. And every time she looked at Britt, she saw the reflection of every mistake she had ever made. Faison hadn't just stolen her daughter, he had made Liesel complicit in her silence. Now she fought like a woman possessed, not for redemption, but for restitution. Outside their isolated orbit, Port Charles churned. The surface still gleamed with normalcy, but underneath, the cracks had begun to spread. Anna began noticing patterns, surveillance records missing from WSB archives, ghost agents on payrolls, funding traced to non-existent labs. Her instincts screamed that the shadows Jason spoke of were real. Robert, though cynical, confirmed similar anomalies in global intelligence circuits. High-profile disappearances, encrypted data blocks, and now, whispers from the underground that a new program was seeking test subjects in South America. Sunny sources in the black market pharmaceutical trade mentioned shipments of a rare drug moving through Eastern Europe under different aliases, some matching the compound's chemical fingerprint. The enemy was no longer a man. It was a doctrine. A doctrine rooted in the belief that free will could be bent to design, that humanity could be hacked and reshaped through biology and signal. Britt wasn't the endgame. She was the beginning. If the serum worked on her, others would follow. Children born into the program. Adults tricked into clinical trials. Soldiers reconditioned under the guise of therapy. Jason realized that Faison's greatest legacy was not terror, it was obedience. A world where the mind could be written like code and rewritten by those who held the key. Determined to act, Jason began building a covert network. Not just spies and doctors, but hackers, tech analysts, former WSB defectors, even patients who had escaped from similar programs. He didn't trust institutions anymore. He couldn't. Too many had turned a blind eye or been compromised. This war would be fought in basements, in labs, in digital backdoors, not in courtrooms or press conferences. Britt was the map, and every memory she recovered became a clue. Every whisper she uttered in her sleep was catalogued and cross-referenced. Liesel continued refining a counter-serum, a molecular blocker that might stop the transmission. But they were running out of time. The system that controlled Britt may have been damaged, but if it had backups, or worse, if there were mobile units, then others were already at risk. And yet, despite the despair, there were moments of hope. Britt's eyes began to reflect emotion again. She cried when she heard her mother humming lullabies from her childhood. She flinched less when Jason touched her hand. One day, she whispered something that broke Jason's heart, "Don't let me disappear again." It was enough. Enough to keep going. Jason made a vow under his breath, holding her trembling fingers. He would not allow Faison's ghost to haunt another life. He would tear this network down, brick by brick, code by code, until no one else could be reduced to a shell of who they were. He didn't care how deep the rot went, he would dig it out. Even if it meant burning the foundations of Port Charles to the ground. Because for Jason, this wasn't just a fight to save Britt. This was a fight for every stolen mind, every rewritten soul, every silent scream buried under layers of chemical submission. This was the reckoning Faison had escaped for far too long. And now, whether in blood, in data, or in flame, justice would find him. Even if it meant dragging his legacy into the light piece by piece. Jason would not rest. Not until the last thread of Faison's twisted creation was severed. And Britt could finally, truly, live again. At last, under a sky littered with stars that shimmered like fragments of shattered hope, Jason stood alone on the balcony of General Hospital, the cool night wind brushing against his face, carrying with it the scent of disinfectant, steel, and something far more fragile, uncertainty. Behind him, in the dim light of a sterile hospital room, Britt lay unconscious, her body still fighting off the remnants of the toxins and programming forced upon her by her own father. The machines monitoring her vitals beeped in a steady rhythm, but her silence was deafening. For weeks now, Jason had measured his days not by the clock but by the flickers of life in her gaze, the ghost of recognition in her trembling hands. Tonight, though, her stillness felt like a fragile truce between life and whatever darkness still lingered inside her mind. Jason's fists clenched as he leaned on the cold metal railing. His mind was a battlefield of memories and rage. He had faced monsters before, killers, warlords, crime bosses, enemies who wore their evil like armor, but Faison was different. Faison didn't destroy through force alone, he corrupted, rewired, and reshaped until his victims no longer knew where he ended and they began. Jason had watched Britt unravel slowly in the days after her rescue, smiling one moment, screaming the next, disoriented by voices in her head that only she could hear. That was the horror of it all. Britt hadn't just been used. She had been stolen from herself. And what terrified Jason more than anything was knowing that Faison had nearly succeeded. But not anymore. As he looked out over the city, a cold resolve settled into his bones. He didn't know if Faison was truly dead. He didn't know if the ghost that haunted the edge of every digital transmission, every broken piece of corrupted data, was a living man or a lingering echo. But he did know one thing with absolute certainty, this war was far from over. What they had uncovered at 5 Poppies was only a fraction of the network. The list of coded patient files recovered from the wreckage was incomplete. There were whispers from Eastern Europe, encrypted messages still being sent from abandoned DVX relays, and rumors that some of the most advanced biotech firms had quietly begun trials on behavioral recalibration methods eerily similar to Faison's serum. Something had survived him. Whether it was a person, a program, or a plan. It was still out there. And this time, Jason would not wait for the enemy to strike. No one else would suffer like Britt. No one else would be reduced to a vessel for another man's ambition. She wasn't a subject. She wasn't a victim. She was a survivor. And more than that, she was a symbol. A symbol of resistance, of resilience, of the fire that refuses to be extinguished. For all the damage Faison had inflicted, he had failed to destroy her spirit completely. Somewhere inside that battered mind, Britt still clung to who she was. And Jason would move heaven and earth to bring her back fully, to erase every trace of programming, to restore every memory, every moment, every shard of herself that had been fractured. Faison's shadow still loomed large over Port Charles. His name, once whispered in fear, was now spoken only in bitter anger. But Jason had no more fear left in him. What once haunted him now fueled him. Every mistake, every loss, every wound Faison had ever inflicted would now be weaponized in return. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen. It was about drawing a line that would never be crossed again. And Jason would not fight alone. Liesel, broken but unyielding, had become more than a scientist. She was a soldier in this war, driven by a guilt so profound that it had forged a new strength in her. Anna and Robert had begun tracing the international spiderweb of biotech investments tied to former DVX affiliates. Sonny, quietly and efficiently, had begun purging his network of anyone connected to Sidwell's pharmaceutical laundering front. The people of Port Charles, those who had once cowered in the shadow of Faison, were rising with purpose. Because they were no longer victims of the past. They were survivors of it. And they would not let it repeat. As Jason turned back toward Britt's room, he paused, watching her through the glass. Her chest rose and fell with a shaky rhythm, her face serene in the haze of sedation, her lips parting as if searching for words she could not yet form. She had been through hell, but she was still fighting. And if she could fight, so could he. He whispered to himself, as much a vow as it was a battle cry, never again. No more puppets. No more ghosts. Britt was no longer a tool in someone else's plan.